Okay, our next topic is obedience. Obedience closely related to compliance. Once again, getting someone to do what you want them to do. However, this time a little more wide open. Punishment is a possibility, and it's within this field that we have what is arguably the most famous study in the field of psychology. It was performed by Stanley Milgram, a social psychologist at Yale University in the early 60s. And it had to do with, Milgram was motivated by a historic event that had occurred not too far in the past at that time. One that we all, unfortunately, are familiar with, the Holocaust. And just like anyone, when something horrific happens, Milgram wondered, how could this have happened? How could those people have done that? Remember, when you're hearing this, think about the fundamental attribution error. Trying to understand why people take certain actions. And Milgram had a working hypothesis that it was something about German culture that allowed this to happen. So, to test his hypothesis, he first wanted to get a control group. He designed an experiment, and he wanted to get a control group. So he used a group of Americans from around the New Haven area where he worked. And he got a number of adult males to come in and do his experiment. The design of the experiment had a great impact. It was earth-shattering in the field of psychology. And what I'd like you to do is to use the link that is on the Blackboard site under Camtasia Lectures, Social Influences. I put a link there. It would have been right next to the link for this lecture. Please watch the film, and it's very interesting. Understand the method that Milgram used and the conclusion, the results and the conclusions reached. And after you're done watching that, come back to this film and we'll go over Milgram's conclusions about why people behaved the way they did. Okay, so please go to that film now. Okay, welcome back. Rather astounding experiment, yes? So, what did Milgram conclude? Why did people act the way they did? Why were they willing to give those shocks to someone who was crying out in pain, or had even stopped crying and may have seemed as if they were already dead? These were ordinary people. Why were they willing to take such extreme actions? Well, Milgram tried to answer that question, and he came up with 4 separate factors that he believed were important. First, the fact that the person, that the participants were working with was a scientist was crucially important, because there's a general assumption that scientists are trying to help people, help humanity, to find answers that are going to make our lives better in some way, to ease suffering. All these things are part of the mission of science. So when a scientist tells you to continue, despite the fact that your perception is that I may be hurting someone, these people thought to themselves, well, this guy knows better, and he is asking me to continue. So they continued thinking that this other person knew more than they did. This issue will come up again when we come to Ash's conformity study. This would be considered informational influence of the person they were working with. Also, the scientist, in this case, the person who was acting as the scientist, also took responsibility for whatever happened. Okay? That fact made people more likely to obey as well. Milgram did a follow-up study in which participants came to an office building in downtown New Haven instead of the Yale University campus, and Milgram found that participants in that situation, in that context, were much less likely to obey. And also he did a follow-up study in which the researcher, the person posing as the experimenter, did not take responsibility for whatever happened in the experiment. And once again, the level of obedience, the number of shocks that people were willing to give was greatly reduced. Okay. So here's the second one. This is what I was referring to with regard to Milgram's taking responsibility and accepting whatever happened was going to be ascribed to him. Okay, so beliefs about science and the fact that somebody, also the Milgram's demeanor, or the experimenter, that wasn't actually Milgram, but the experimenter in that film was very calm. And you remember from the social development chapter, something that Ainsworth used with regard to attachment in infants was a phenomenon known as social referencing. When you're in an ambiguous situation and you don't know, is this safe, isn't this safe? You look around. How are other people reacting? Well, in this case, the participants were very concerned, but they kept looking to the experimenter, who was very calm and simply said, we need for you to continue with the experiment. That everything's fine, please continue. And that self-assurance and the social referencing that the participants did led them to conclude, even though they were confused, that this must be okay. Okay, with regard to this one, think about the factors influencing compliance. Remember, if people are closer to you, you're more likely to comply. Well, in this one, the experimenter was sitting right next to the actual experimenter, was sitting right next to the participant. And the person who was getting shocked, the person that the participants thought was another participant, who actually was a Confederate, who wasn't really getting shocked, but was crying out as if he was, that person was in another room. So he was further away. The person who was seemed to be in charge was sitting right there. The person that was being shocked was way over there, in another room. Milgram did an experiment where he switched and had the person who was supposedly getting shocked, the Confederate, in the same room as the participant, and he, or the person, his research assistant, was in the other room. And once again, obedience, willingness to give the shocks was greatly reduced. And finally, an interesting technique was part of this experiment. Remember foot in the door technique from compliance techniques. This is where you ask for something small. Once you get it, you ask for something big. Well, in this case, Milgram set up the switches for the shock, and they were graduated from 15 volts to 30 to 45 to 60, 75, etc., always increasing by 15 volts. Now here's the problem with that. For the participant, here's the problem. At any time, if the participant was to decide, I'm giving a dangerous shock, I should stop, or this next shock would be dangerous to give, I should stop, they would have to admit that the one they'd already given was dangerous because it was only 15 volts more. So once you started, it was very difficult to stop without admitting wrongdoing. So the situation is very manipulative. And what Milgram showed was, suffice it to say, he never made his trip to Germany to compare German people and Americans. Because what he found was, if a situation is set up in a certain way, people are capable of almost anything. And that is why this is such a groundbreaking study, such an alarming study in many ways. That people found things that were very unpleasant to learn. Okay, so Milgram found out something about the Holocaust. At least he reached the conclusion that something like that could happen anywhere. It was not ethnocentric, like only those people could do that. Anybody could, given the situation. And the Milgram study is also brought up many times in research methods, because some people question, was this ethical to do? You saw those people in that film. They were very distraught about what they were doing. Milgram put these people in a very stressful situation. He brought them back for debriefing. He debriefed them right there. But he also brought them back 6 months later to discuss the experiment with him. And as he reported, many of them claimed that it was very disturbing, but that they felt good that they had participated in this. Nevertheless, this is a study that led to revamping of ethical procedures in psychology.